The rancher had not smiled in 7 years, until the obese widow's little girl said, "My mama can fix that." The fence gate between the two properties had not moved in 3 years. It moved on a Tuesday morning when a mule put its nose through the gap and a little girl's voice carried across the yard like it owned every inch of it. "Mama, is that ours?" Emmett Cross looked up from the fence post he was setting. A wagon had stopped on the road next door. On the bench sat a woman, large and dark-haired, her whole body leaning forward the way people lean when they have been traveling toward something for a long time and have finally arrived. Beside her stood a little girl of about 5, standing rather than sitting as though sitting were a suggestion she had considered and set aside. Her dark eyes moved across the 12 neglected acres next door, the broken shutters, the grass gone tall, the goat pen with the latch hanging wrong, looking at all of it without discouragement. The way a child looks at broken things she has already decided to fix. "It is now," the woman said. The little girl looked at the property. Then she looked directly at Emmett, the way she had regarded the broken shutters. Like something she was deciding about. He was not a man people looked at directly anymore. The town had learned the geography of his silence and navigated around it. But this child had not learned that yet, and her gaze was steady and unhurried and completely without the cautious deference adults managed around him. Emmett turned back to his fence post. Behind him her voice came again, small and unhurried, simply reporting a fact to her mother. He didn't wave. The woman's voice came back, low and even. "Some people forget how." A pause, and then the little girl said with complete seriousness, "We could remind him." And Emmett's hands went still on the wire. He did not turn around. But something shifted in his chest that had not shifted in a long time. His kitchen had 2 cups once. He had put one away the morning after the funeral and never taken it back out. 1 cup, 1 chair, 1 place at the table, everything arranged around the shape of what was gone and called order. Nobody in Harrow Falls asked about the wife. Nobody asked about the baby. Nobody asked about the 7 years. That was simply how things were. The 12 acres next door had been empty since Caleb Poole died the previous winter. His sister, Emmett would discover, was not built for quiet the way Caleb had been. Her name was Vivian Poole. A large woman, broad through the shoulders, full through the body, the kind of presence that filled a doorway and made no apology for it. The town she came from had always had opinions about that, held carefully behind closed lips until her husband left and gave those opinions somewhere to go. His name was Thomas. He had not been cruel, which somehow made it worse. Cruel men you can be angry at cleanly. Thomas had simply looked at his life one Wednesday evening and chosen a different road, and the town's air had changed after that the way air changes before weather. Vivian breathed that changed air for 2 years, counting coins on the kitchen table, letting down Nell's dress hem a 3rd time. She endured it 2 years. Then Caleb died and left her 12 acres in Harrow Falls, and Vivian packed everything that mattered. Nell, the mule she'd saved 11 months to buy, and a small tin of her mother's sewing needles she could not explain keeping except that her mother's hands had touched them last, and some things you do not leave behind even when you cannot say why. She did not look back when she left. But Nell did, turning on the wagon bench to watch things disappear, as though she already understood that you had to remember where you came from to know how far you had traveled. The cabin smelled of dust and old wood and something that might become home if she gave it enough time. The list of what needed doing was long. She set her shoulders, pushed up her sleeves, and started at the top, which is when the goat found her. It emerged from behind the broken pen, regarding Vivian with the expression of an animal that had been its own authority for 3 months and saw no reason to renegotiate. Nell walked directly to it and said, "Hello," and then, "We live here now," in the tone of someone issuing a fact. The goat considered this and walked through the broken latch toward the neighboring property with complete purpose. Vivian went after it. She found it sampling a cabbage in a very well-maintained vegetable garden on the other side of the fence, and she found her neighbor standing at the garden's edge, tall, broad, weathered, his face having the quality of a door closed from the inside. He looked at the goat and said, "That your animal," in the tone of a man stating the beginning of a problem. Vivian said it had been on the property when she arrived. He said, "Caleb's goat," and nothing else. She moved across his garden and retrieved the goat by its back left leg. A choice the goat communicated its feelings about at considerable volume, and when she straightened up he was holding a piece of paper toward her. A bill. Itemized. 2 cabbages and 1/2 row of early lettuce. "I've been here less than an hour," she said. But he was already walking back toward the house, and the door closed behind him with the quiet certainty of a man who has said everything he intends to say. From the other side of the fence came Nell's voice. "Mama, I don't think he likes us." Vivian looked at the bill and the door and the goat, which was attempting to eat the paper. "He doesn't know us yet," she said, and picked up the goat and carried it home under one arm. That evening one of Emmett's ranch hands appeared at her fence line, young, polite, holding his hat, saying Mr. Cross asked that she secure her animals. The goat had crossed his south fence, the chickens had been through the east wire twice, and the mule had been at his mare's fence post for the better part of an hour. Vivian looked across the property to where Emmett stood at the far end of his south pasture with his back precisely toward her, and said pleasantly that she had received the message. That evening she put Nell to bed and sat on the porch step and looked at her land in the dark. 12 acres hers. The list long and the night quiet, and both of those things fine. Across the fence 1 lamp burned in his window, and she had been that lamp once, burning alone not because there was anything to stay up for but because turning it off meant admitting the dark was all there was. "We're going to be fine," Nell said from inside, talking to the goat which had installed itself on the porch without being invited. "We are," Vivian said quietly. "We are." Across the fence Emmett stood at his window looking at the lamp that had appeared next door, yellow and warm, the first light on that side of the fence in 3 years. He stood there longer than he meant to. He did not take the second cup from the cabinet, though he stood at it for a moment with his hand on the door before going to bed, where he lay for a long time without sleeping. The goat chewed through the first rope by mid-morning. She tried a second, thicker, and drove the stake deeper, and the goat pulled it clean out of the ground and stood in the yard wearing it like a necklace. Meanwhile, the chickens found a gap in the east wire and made their way through with the efficiency of creatures that had been planning this for some time, and the mule watched Emmett's mare through the fence with the devoted attention of someone who has found a reason to be somewhere and intends to stay. Nell observed all of this from the porch with her chin in her hands. "Biscuit doesn't like the rope," she said, having named the goat on the second day and considered the matter settled. "And the chickens want to be on the other side. And the mule is in love." She thought about it seriously. "I'll talk to them." And she climbed down and crouched in front of the goat and had a conversation with it in a low, serious voice that lasted several minutes, and the goat appeared to listen. It did not stop crossing the fence, but it began waiting until Nell was occupied elsewhere before it did, which suggested a level of strategic awareness that Vivian found more alarming than reassuring. It was during one of these chases, Vivian moving fast across the uneven yard, skirts in both hands, her dark hair coming loose from its pins, that she heard it from the direction of the bunkhouse. Suppressed laughter, the kind that has been held too long and is escaping in pieces. 2 of Emmett's ranch hands had found something deeply interesting to examine near the fence line. She stopped and straightened up and looked at them directly, and they found urgent business elsewhere with impressive speed. She looked across the property. Emmett was coming out of his barn, and she could tell by the careful way he was looking at the middle distance, with the specific focused attention of a man directing his eyes away from something on purpose, that he had seen all of it. The set of his shoulders as he walked away was not entirely the same as the set of his shoulders when he had walked toward, as though something had shifted in him very slightly that he had not given permission for and was not going to acknowledge. She noticed. She said nothing, but she noticed. It was a butterfly that took Nell across the fence the first time, yellow, large, landing on the post and then lifting and drifting toward the neighboring property, and Nell followed it with the same completeness, simply there one moment and gone the next. When Vivian looked up, she saw Nell standing in the long grass of Emmett's property with her hand outstretched and the butterfly resting on her finger, her face carrying the particular stillness of a child in the presence of something sacred. Emmett was 20 feet away working on the barn wall. On his face was something Vivian had not seen there before, not the careful closed expression he wore for everything, but something underneath it. Something that had been covered a long time and was not entirely covered now. He looked at Nell the way a man looks at something that costs him something to look at. Vivian started toward the fence. Then stopped herself. The butterfly lifted. Nell watched it go and then turned and saw Emmett. "There was a butterfly," she said. "I saw it," he said. "Yellow," Nell added helpfully. "I know," he said. Nell nodded, satisfied the facts were established, and looked at the barn wall. "What's wrong with it?" "The board's rotted." She examined it seriously. "The one next to it looks rotted too." He looked. "You're right," he said, and Nell appeared quietly satisfied, and she stood there watching him work with the easy comfort of a child who has not yet learned that silence between people requires management. He did not tell her to leave. Vivian stood at the fence and watched her daughter stand in complete easy silence next to a man who had not willingly been in anyone's company for 7 years. She lowered her hand from the wire and did not call Nell back. The breakfast happened on a Thursday, because the mule had spent 2 days working on the gate latch with patient-focused attention until he understood the mechanism, and the goat had apparently shared the intelligence with the chickens. Emmett came down to find his barn gate open, Biscuit on his kitchen chair, and 3 chickens in the vegetable garden. He dealt with the barn and the chickens, then came back to find Biscuit on his chair and his breakfast eaten directly off his plate. Every egg, all the bread, consumed with the focused professional attention of an animal that considers itself entitled. He stood in the kitchen looking at the empty plate for a long moment, and then from outside came running, boots on uneven ground, and Vivian appeared in his open doorway with her hair half undone and a rope in one hand that had clearly been doing no good at all, her face carrying the expression of a woman who is genuinely mortified but has also stopped being surprised by anything. She said, "I am so sorry, the gate, I don't know how he," and Emmett picked up the plate and carried it to the sink and said, "2 eggs. It's fine," and when she said it was not fine and she would replace it, he said, "Leave it," in the tone of a man who has made a decision he is not going to explain. From outside, "Biscuit. Come here right now." Biscuit got off the chair and walked out the door with immense dignity. And Emmett stood at the sink while something moved through him. Not quite a reaction, not quite nothing. The specific internal movement of a man who has been surprised by something he did not expect to find funny and is not going to admit it, and is aware that the effort of not admitting it is more visible than the thing itself. Vivian saw it. She said nothing. She walked home across the yard, her wide hips rolling with her stride, shoulders straight, rope swinging from one hand, and she was smiling. That evening Nell sat on the porch and said, "Mama," and when Vivian said, "Tu," she said, "Mr. Emmett almost had a feeling today." Vivian set down the hem she was working on. Nell thought about it. He looks at things like he's checking they're still there. Like he's waiting for them to go. Vivian said carefully that some people have had things taken from them and it takes a long time before they stop waiting for it to happen again. Nell was quiet. Then, "Like me waiting for Papa to come back." Vivian took her daughter's hand. "Just something like that." Nell looked at the lamp burning across the fence. "Maybe we should just stay," she said, "so he can stop waiting." Vivian looked at her daughter, 5 years old, sitting in the dusk, having arrived without effort at the kind of understanding that takes most people a lifetime, and said, "Maybe we should." That night Vivian found Nell at the window in the dark in her nightgown, her small face close to the glass, watching the lamp across the fence, making sure it was still there. Her daughter had learned, too young, too early, that people disappear and lamps go out, and the only way to know something is still there is to keep checking. Vivian carried her back to bed and lay beside her, holding on a little tighter than usual. Across the fence Emmett Cross sat at his table with the stone Nell had left on his fence post. He had picked it up that afternoon without deciding to, his hands simply closing around it as he passed, and he turned it over in his palm. Smooth and ordinary. Left by a child who didn't know yet that some people had stopped accepting gifts. He closed his hand around it and sat in the quiet without fighting it. The mare started laboring badly at midnight. Wrong position, wrong timeline, the particular distress of something that should be progressing and isn't. His ranch hand was away until morning. Emmett had what his hands knew, the lamp and the night. Vivian saw the light in his barn moving the way a lamp moves when someone is carrying it with urgency. She lay there 2 minutes. Then she got up, woke Nell gently, and told her they were going next door. Nell asked no questions, simply put on her boots, took her blanket and came. Emmett heard the gate and turned. Vivian was in the barn doorway with Nell beside her wrapped in her blanket, both of them taking in the situation with the quick assessment of people who have learned to understand emergencies fast. He said she should go back. She said, "Tell me what to do." He looked at her hands, at the fact that she was there at midnight without being asked and without making it a gesture, and said, "Come here. And do exactly what I say." She said, "Yes," and came. She did not pretend to know things she didn't know, and when she didn't understand she said so immediately, and he told her, and she did it without wasting time on pride or apology. Her hands steady, her attention complete. Nell sat on a hay bale in the corner and did not speak, watching everything with her careful eyes. Once Vivian looked over and Nell gave her a single small nod, the nod of someone who has assessed the situation and found it manageable. The foal arrived at dawn, shaking on new legs in the straw, furious at the cold, making the sound of something that has just discovered it exists. Vivian was on her knees in the hay, covered in everything, her hair loose and her dress ruined, and she didn't move for a moment, just looked at the foal finding its feet. Emmett crouched across from her and looked at Nell, asleep on the hay bale with her blanket to her chin and her face completely peaceful in the gray dawn light. He looked at that small sleeping child for a long moment. Something moved through his face that was not the careful closed expression he wore for everything. Something older, something that had been waiting under 7 years of silence for something living to look at. He said nothing, but he did not look away. They sat in the barn doorway after, both too tired to move. After a while Vivian said, "I didn't know what I was doing in there," and he said, "I know," and she said, "I was terrified the whole time," and he said, "I know that too." The pause. "You didn't show it." "I've learned not to." He was quiet. "So have I." It was the most honest thing either of them had said to the other, and it sat between them without needing anything added to it. Then Nell appeared in the doorway, blanket around her shoulders, hair flattened from the hay bale, and sat down between them without asking permission. The three of them looked out at the morning and nobody said anything and nobody needed to. That evening the sky changed all at once, iron-colored in under an hour, wind from the north with the particular insistence of something that intends to stay. Emmett appeared at her fence line and looked at her roof and said, "Storm's going to be bad. Bring the child." She looked at him and he looked at the sky and said, "My house is solid. Yours isn't," and turned and walked back. Vivian stood in her yard with the wind coming up and looked at her roof and looked at Nell in the doorway watching, and said, "Get your blanket." His house was exactly what she expected and nothing she was prepared for, clean and precise, everything in its place, a good stove and a solid table and 2 chairs and 1 cup on the shelf. She saw it immediately, understood it immediately, said nothing. He showed Nell the small room at the back with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man completing a practical task. Nell walked in, looked at the bed, looked at him, and said, "Thank you," with the gravity of a diplomat. He said, "You're welcome," with the same gravity back. Vivian stood in his kitchen listening to the storm arrive and felt something she could not entirely name, something about being inside a house that had been sealed for 7 years and finding it warmer than she expected. She woke in the chair by the stove at some deep hour with the lamp low, and Emmett sat at his table holding his coffee cup the way people hold something familiar in the dark. From the back room came Nell's voice, small and blurred with sleep. "Don't leave. Emmett was on his feet before Vivian was fully awake. She watched from the doorway as he went to Nell's bedside. Nell still mostly asleep, her small hand reaching, her face creased with the specific distress of a child dreaming about a loss she has never fully processed. "Don't leave. Please stay." Emmett sat on the edge of the bed and took her hand, and he sat there in the dark holding a sleeping child's hand while Vivian watched from the doorway and could not speak. Nell's face smoothed. Her breathing evened. She settled into the blanket with the complete trust of a child whose body has received the answer it needed. And Emmett sat there long after, a man who had lost a child before she ever opened her eyes, sitting in the dark next to this small living breathing girl who had asked him to stay, and he stayed. In the morning he made breakfast without announcement, simply got up before they were fully awake and made it. Vivian came out to find the table set for three cups, 3 plates, 3 places at a table that had had one for 7 years, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at it and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the table hadn't already said. Nell appeared beside her, took one look, walked to her chair, sat down, and began eating with the complete naturalness of someone who has always had a place here. The rupture came that afternoon. She was back at her property assessing the storm damage to the roof when she heard him at the shared fence line behind her. "You need to get proper help with that roof," he said. "Someone who knows what they're doing." She didn't turn around. "I'll manage it." "You've been managing it for weeks and it's worse than when you started." She turned around then. "I appreciate your concern, but this land, this work, it's not something you learn as you go." He said it the way you say something you've been holding too long, without measuring where it lands. Not with a child depending on you. Caleb should have left it to someone who understood what they were taking on. The words landed. Not like a blow, like a key turning in a lock she had thought she'd changed. She had heard this before. Not these words exactly. This essential message. From Thomas. From a town. From every version of the same voice that had been telling her the same thing for years. "You don't belong here. You're not enough for this." She looked at him for one long moment. Then she picked up her tools and went inside and closed the door softly. He stood in her yard. He knew immediately, not because of anything she said but because of what happened to her face before she turned away. He had seen a woman hear something she had heard too many times before. He had put it there and went home. The days that followed had the shape of her absence. She worked her land and nodded if they crossed paths and did not leave eggs on his post, and Nell stopped leaving things on his fence post, and he noticed it the first morning and every morning after, walking past the empty post and feeling the specific weight of a small thing gone that you had not known you were depending on until it stopped. He repaired her fence one morning, proper posts, 3 hours, no bill, no note. And when he finished and turned, Nell was there in the window watching him, and he looked at her and she looked at him and he looked away first. He found the needle tin near the fence line 2 days later, half hidden in the long grass, and he recognized it, had seen her carry it with the careful hands of someone handling something they cannot replace, and he picked it up and put it in his pocket next to the stone. That night he sat on his porch with the stone in one pocket and the tin in the other and the fence post empty, thinking about a table set for 3 and a child's hand in the dark and the specific expression on a woman's face when she hears the thing she has heard too many times. Sitting there until very late before going inside and standing at the cabinet where the second cup had lived since the morning after the funeral, not taking it out but looking at it for a long time. Harrow Falls had a way of warming to people slowly, and Vivian had felt the warming. The baker who learned her order, the women at church who made space on the bench, the slow, careful accumulation of nods and names that means a town is deciding to include you. She felt it shift on a Tuesday in October when she walked into the general store and the conversation thinned, the way air thins at altitude, enough to notice if you know what full air feels like. She knew. She had lived in thinned air for 2 years before she left the last place. She bought what she needed and walked home with her chin level, her shoulders straight, her hands steady, a large woman walking through a town that was deciding something about her, and she was going to walk through it at full size, without apology. But she felt it. Emmett saw her come home that afternoon. He was doing fence work on the south side, and he watched Vivian walk from the road to her door with the careful, upright posture of someone who has absorbed something and is not going to let it show until they are somewhere private. He knew that walk. He had worn it himself for 7 years. He said nothing and went back to his fence. But he watched until she was inside. Margaret Hale came 3 days later with a covered dish and an expression of warm concern so well constructed it could almost pass for the real thing. Vivian let them in. Margaret moved through the cabin with her eyes doing careful work while her mouth said pleasant things, looking at the stove, the mended curtains, the organized shelves. Then her eyes found Nell and stayed there, finding the dress, the hem let down 3 times and doing its best. "What a serious little face," she said warmly, while her eyes did arithmetic. Then she looked at Vivian with the particular expression of a woman about to say something devastating with the delivery of something kind. "It must be so hard," she said, "managing all of this alone. A child needs stability, guidance, a proper foundation. We do wonder sometimes whether this environment is truly what's best for her." The room was very quiet. Vivian looked at Margaret standing in her cabin looking at her daughter with concern that was a weapon with the blade turned inward, so you couldn't call it a weapon. She said, "Thank you for the dish. I'll return it when it's washed." Margaret left with the satisfied expression of someone who has planted something and expects it to grow. Vivian sat on the floor against the wall after they went, not crying but pressing her hands flat on the floorboards and breathing. She knew she was enough for Nell the way she knew the weight of the needle tin, by something older than argument, deeper than proof. But knowing and being immune are different things. Nell came in from the yard and sat down beside her without a word, putting her small shoulder against her mother's arm. After a while she said, "Those ladies don't like us." Vivian said, "They don't know us yet." Nell thought about it. "Mr. Emmett didn't know us either. He kept my stone." Vivian put her arm around her daughter and held on. That evening the sun went down and Emmett did not go inside. He sat on his porch in the dark watching the lamp that came on next door, lower than usual, later than usual, and after a while her door opened and she came out and sat on her porch step. She saw him and he saw her. Nell appeared in the doorway behind her, looked at both of them sitting on their respective sides of the fence in the dark, and went back inside quietly, leaving the door open. Because she always knew. The silence between them was different from before, not hostile, not careful, just 2 people sitting in the dark not being alone and finding that different from what they expected. After a while he spoke. "The south post on your enclosure is going to give before winter. I'll fix it. I'll bring a post." The pause. "The kind that isn't empty." "What was he like?" she said. "Caleb. Here." He was quiet a moment looking at the dark. "Quiet," he said. "Kept to himself. Good with the land. Showed up when it mattered." "That sounds like him." She was quiet a moment. "He never told me much either." "Why didn't you visit?" he said. Not accusatory. Just a question he had carried since the wagon stopped. She looked at her hands. "I kept meaning to," she said. "I kept thinking there was time." He went completely still. He knew that sentence. He knew the specific weight of it, not like grief which announces itself but like a stone in the pocket you reach for without thinking and find every time. His mouth opened. He closed it. "Post will be there by noon," he said. He got up. He went inside. She watched him go. She knew he had almost said something. She didn't push it. Inside, Nell's voice came from her bed. "Mama." "Yes." "He's coming back tomorrow." "I know." "Good," said Nell, and went to sleep. There are people who carry their grief so quietly for so long that the world forgets they are carrying anything at all. And then someone says 4 words on a dark porch, and something in that quiet person recognizes them from the inside. That night, as if the world understood that something had finally cracked open and needed testing, Nell's fever started. By midnight it was the kind of heat that makes a mother's hands stop being steady. Vivian did everything right, Cool cloths, the right tea, Nell in her arms by the stove, but she was alone at midnight with a sick child, and alone has a weight that accumulates in the dark in a way it doesn't during the day. At 2 in the morning she heard boots on the porch and then a knock. Emmett Cross stood in the dark with his hat in his hands. She could see by his face that he had stood at the fence for some time before coming, that this had cost him something, that something in him had argued against it, and he had come anyway. He looked at Nell in the chair and looked at Vivian and came in and sat down across the room. Not taking over. Not filling the silence with reassurance she hadn't asked for. Simply sitting and being present the way a person is present when they understand that presence itself is the thing required. Around 3 the fever broke. Nell opened her eyes and looked at her mother and then across the room at Emmett sitting in the low lamplight. She looked at him for a long moment and said, "You came." What crossed his face in that moment was not only relief. It was the face of a man who once sat in a room and watched a different child not open its eyes. And this one had. The distance between those 2 moments was 7 years and it lived in him completely, and it was there in his face for just a moment before he put the careful expression back. Vivian saw it and understood it. Not just a neighbor who had come in the night, but a man who had lost everything and come anyway. Who had every reason to stay on his side of the fence and had knocked on her door at 2 in the morning because a child's lamp was burning. She sat down on the floor next to Nell's chair and held her daughter's hand and did not cry exactly but came very close. The town gathering was held on the last Friday of October, and Vivian went because not going would have said something she wasn't willing to say. She wore her good dress, did Nell's hair carefully, and walked in with her chin at the level it belonged, a large woman entering a room that had been thinking about her, entering it like she had every right to be there. Because she did. Margaret Hale was near the refreshment table, and her words carried the way words carry in rooms with low ceilings. I just think about that little girl. Out there on that rough land, no proper guidance, no father, a mother who, bless her heart, is doing her absolute best. But some situations simply aren't fair to the child. We have to think about what's best for the little one, don't we? The room shifted and waited, arranging itself around the new information the way a flock of birds arranges around a change in wind. Vivian stood very still. She had been here before, different room and different words but the same architecture, and she kept her chin level and did not look at the floor. Nell had been standing beside her. She looked at her mother's face. She looked at Margaret. Then she turned and looked across to where Emmett Cross was standing near the door with a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk, very still, watching. Nell walked across the room, straight-backed, deliberate, the stride of someone whose terms are already settled, crossed the full width of it, and stopped beside Emmett and stood there. Just stood there, 5 years old, beside him, facing the room. She looked up at him and gave one small nod in the direction of her mother. Well? He set his cup down. He looked at the room, the careful arranged faces, Margaret Hale with her warm expression of concern, Vivian standing alone with her chin at the right level and her hands still at her sides. He spoke without raising his voice, with the precise economy of a man who has been quiet for 7 years and whose words therefore carry the weight of everything he has not said. Vivian Poole came to this town with 12 neglected acres and a broken property and has spent 4 months building something from it with her own hands. Her daughter is fed and cared for and loved by a mother who has not once asked this town for anything. He looked at Margaret directly. Not one person in this room came to that property in 4 months to offer so much as an hour of help. She learned not to ask. That is not her failing. He looked at the room. That is ours. The silence was complete. Margaret opened her mouth. He looked at her and she closed it. Then he looked at Vivian, not at the room, not at anyone else. Just at her. And what was in that look was not rescue and not pity and not even kindness exactly but witness. I see you. I have been seeing you. I'm not looking away. They walked out together, Nell between them, her small hand finding his without asking and her other hand in her mother's, the 3 of them walking out into the cold October evening like people who have always known which way they were going. At the fence line he stopped and looked at the gate. The gate Nell had been using for weeks. The gate he had pretended not to notice. He opened it and stepped through to her side. "Nell's been using this gate for weeks," Vivian said. "I know," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved and something gathered in his face the way weather gathers. Not sudden and not performed but arriving because the conditions were finally right after 7 years of the wrong ones. Nell had run ahead chasing Biscuit in the last of the evening light. She turned around and saw his face and shouted, "Mama! There it is. I told you," and Vivian laughed, and the smile completed itself. 7 years, right there, full and unguarded, just a smile on a face that had forgotten what one felt like from the inside. Nell ran back and wrapped both arms around his leg without ceremony, and he stood very still. Then his hand came down and rested on her small back the way a man's hand rests on something he has chosen not to lose. Vivian watched this, and something in her that had been braced for a very long time, the specific tension of a woman who has learned that people leave and things can be taken, released. Just released. Like a breath held so long you forgot you were holding it. That evening Vivian found 2 things on her porch. The needle tin, her mother's tin, which she had thought lost, sitting on the rail exactly as it had always been. And beside it, folded carefully, a piece of fabric. Good cotton. Enough for a child's dress. No note, no explanation. She picked up the tin and held it in both hands, understanding completely. He had found it along the fence line and recognized it and kept it safe and returned it without making it a moment. And the fabric said everything a note would have said more plainly. "I saw what you do. I saw what you were missing. Not doing it for you. Just making it possible." She was still standing there when Nell appeared beside her with something in her small fist, held out toward Vivian with the solemn, deliberate care of someone making an important transfer. A small wooden button, dark wood and worn smooth, from Thomas's coat. The button Nell had carried since the Wednesday evening he didn't come home. In her pocket and in her hand on the wagon and through every morning and night of the 2 years since. "I don't need it anymore," Nell said, her voice completely certain. Not sad. Not performing bravery. Simply certain the way she was certain about everything she had decided thoroughly. "I found someone who stays." Vivian's hands closed around her daughter's hands around the button and she sat down on the porch step and cried, not quietly and not managed but fully, the way you cry when something that has been held tight for a very long time finally understands it is allowed to let go. Nell sat beside her, put her small head on her mother's shoulder, and said, "It's okay, Mama. It's okay." Later, much later, after Nell was asleep, Vivian sat on the porch with 2 lamps burning, one on her side and one on his, and the gate between the properties standing open in the dark the way it had never stood before. Inside, Nell's voice came from her bed, half asleep, talking to Biscuit who had once again installed himself without permission. "We're home," Nell said. "We're actually home." In the morning she would sew a new dress for Nell with her mother's needles and his fabric and every stitch an ordinary act of a life being rebuilt. Across the fence Emmett Cross would wake before dawn the way he always did and stand at his kitchen shelf and take the second cup down and set it on the table next to his. 2 cups. For the first time in 7 years. This is not a story about a man who forgot how to smile. It is about 2 people who had been making themselves smaller for so long they forgot they were allowed to take up space. And it took a goat with no respect for fences and a mule in love with the wrong mare and a 5-year-old girl who never learned that some doors are supposed to stay closed. And one man who finally understood that the bravest thing left, after everything has been lost, is to leave the gate open. Because sometimes that is all that is asked of us. Not great deeds. Not perfect words. Just the courage to leave the gate open when someone needs to come through, and the grace to walk through it when someone leaves it open for you. Nell's first words when the wagon stopped, "Mama, is that ours?" Her last words before she slept, "We're actually home." She was right both times.